Hello, my American history students. This is your final week of distance learning. Last week we talked about the Civil War and how it ended, and this week we're going to focus on the aftermath. What were the repercussions and consequences for the South, and how did the Union manage to come back together again? So we're going to be talking about the period of Reconstruction right now. So let's get right into it. The war is over. So what now? Well, at first glance, it seems that all hope is lost. The North has won and the Union has been preserved. But at what cost? Is it truly possible to bring people together who have had such differing views economically and socially for so long? The war is over, but have minds truly changed? The period after the war became known as Reconstruction. To reconstruct means to rebuild. This period in American history was a time of mending and rebuilding the South and the very fabric of our nation. Different groups of people had different aims or goals for Reconstruction. President Abraham Lincoln's goal remained unchanged. His goal at the start of the Civil War was to preserve the Union at all costs. His goal after the war was to bring the Southern states back into the Union as quickly as possible. If 10% of the voting population pledged allegiance to the Union, a state would be readmitted to the Union. There were those who wanted the South to suffer a bit more, but you will read about them a little later. With the end of the Civil War, many economic and social political changes. The biggest social and economic change was that slavery had ended. Southern plantation owners no longer had a free labor source with which to produce large cash crops for sale to European nations. There was also a lack of railroads in the South, partly because of the total war strategy that destroyed many Southern railroads. So remember, Sherman's march and the Northern Army that came down into the South to fight, because it was mainly fought in the South, basically destroyed everything in the South as they came through. They burned homes, they burned crops, because they wanted the Southern soldiers to not have food, to be less motivated. Okay, they wanted to devastate them emotionally as well. African Americans were happy because they were no longer forcibly enslaved. One of the most devastating effects of slavery was the separation of families. Children were often separated from mothers and sold to other plantations. Once freed, they immediately began searching for family members and began to create communities for themselves and exercise their newly gained rights for the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. For the first time, they were recognized as citizens of the United States with protection under the law. African American males can now exercise their right to vote. As part of the Reconstruction, the Freedmen's Bureau was created to help African Americans adjust to their newfound freedom. They built schools to educate African American children and adults so they could learn how to read and write, a liberty that they had always been denied because of the color of their skin. The Freedmen's Bureau also helped African Americans get good, fair contracts for jobs in sharecropping. Sharecropping was the way African Americans earned money and plantation owners could continue to grow and sell crop shares. Plantation owners paid African Americans to harvest the fields. They allowed families to settle on a portion of the land to make a home and living for themselves. Sharecroppers often got paid by getting a portion of the harvest to sell for themselves. Growers had to be careful about getting treated fairly in sharecropping situations. In addition to getting an education and a job, African Americans men got to exercise a right they had always been denied when they were enslaved. That right was the right to vote. African American men ran for office and cast their ballots for the first time during Reconstruction. It was a time of great political and social change for African Americans and Southern whites, who were forced to grant these freedoms to former enslaved people. During Reconstruction, Union soldiers remained stationed in the South to guarantee and protect the rights of freedmen. Southern states were required to rewrite their state constitutions and expressly abolish and prohibit slavery. They were also required to recognize the freedom and citizenship of all African Americans and were required by federal law to allow African American men to vote in elections. Reconstruction was a time of many social, political, and economic changes. These changes were positive for some groups like African Americans, but not always seen as positive by some Southern people. So let's talk about some of the amendments during the Reconstruction. After the Civil War, several groups had different ideas for Reconstruction. Lincoln's ideas clashed with radical Republicans who wanted a majority of the population to take the loyalty oath, formally abolish slavery, and allow no Confederate officials to serve in Congress. But President Lincoln said that wouldn't last long. President Lincoln was re-elected to a second term in 1865, but was tragically assassinated soon afterwards. His successor was President Andrew Johnson, who had a very different version of Reconstruction than Lincoln did. He wanted to humiliate the South. Pardons would only be granted to those that took a loyalty oath. Pardons would not be available to high-ranking officials in Southern elite. All states would have to abolish slavery and take back secession legislation. At first, President Johnson appeared to be an ally and on the side of the radical Republicans, but that quickly changed when he vetoed the Freedmen's Bureau bill. He didn't want to protect the rights of freedmen. Congress overrode his veto and passed the 14th and 15th Amendments, which granted rights to freedmen. Prior to Lincoln's assassination, the 13th Amendment had been passed. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments together were known as the Reconstruction Amendments. All right, so what did it mean to be an American during this time? The Civil War was over. It's time to come back to some kind of normalcy. But what did that mean? The country was once figuratively split in two, was beginning a new phase of rebuilding or reconstruction. So how did the nation plan to rethink their ideals to reunite as one instead of a Northern society versus a Southern society? Some will suggest that Reconstruction was a new freedom. However, the question remains, freedom for whom? Freedom is not a constant right. Freedom is ever-changing, dependent on the ideas and beliefs of the leadership or the majority in Congress. During Reconstruction, freedom for the enslaved people that were now released from their owners' requirements was put forth. The Freedom Bureau was created in an effort to help previously enslaved African Americans get food and supplies. Land that previously belonged to wealthy plantation owners was redistributed. Schools were established. All in all, some 250,000 freed African Americans were aided by the Freedmen's Bureau. This new freedom, along with the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, redefined a place for African Americans, especially in Southern society. In addition, people like activist Elizabeth Cady Stanton, an abolitionist and women's rights activist, her job was to promote equality, freedom, and citizenship for all. All right, let's talk about Lincoln's legacy. We know he was assassinated, but he was president during the Civil War, and he's mostly known for the Emancipation Proclamation. Abraham Lincoln, having won re-election to a second term as president, decided to go out for a nice night at the theater. Imagine he may have been feeling pretty good because strategies were paying off and the Civil War seemed finally to be coming to an end. He was watching a humorous performance when a Confederate fanatic who was upset at the result at the end of the Civil War snuck into the presidential viewing box and shot him in the back of the head. This happened to President Abraham Lincoln on April 14, 1865, just 5 days after General Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. The shooter, John Wilkes Booth, was an actor who had originally planned to kidnap the president. However, when the plan was foiled, Booth decided to shoot the president. Lincoln was not killed instantly when shot. Instead, he was carried across the street where he was cared for until his passing the next morning. The nation was shocked, and many were in mourning. Lincoln's assassination was a blow to the country. The president had plans to make the country whole again, truly united. His plan would have been relatively easy, especially for the Southerners to accept and carry out. He did not want to punish or humiliate, but instead gain the voters' allegiance back to the Union. He was determined to follow through with the abolition of slavery and redefine the place in society that African Americans would soon hold. He only required that 10% of the voting population pledge loyalty to the Union and follow federal laws regarding slavery. President Lincoln was even willing to let Confederate lawmakers run for office after a short time. It was a good plan and could have worked. All right. The last thing we're going to talk about today is the 3 Reconstruction plans. There was 3 different plans at the time for how America should clean up after the Civil War. So what now? Lincoln's main goal at the end of the Civil War was to have the Union back together as one. His plan, called the 10% Plan, consisted of pardoning some Confederate officials if they agreed to take an oath or allegiance to the Union. They also had to promise loyalty and obey all federal rules, including those related to slavery. When 10% of the eligible voters had taken this oath, the state could have been readmitted now to the Union. But now Lincoln was dead, so his plan couldn't be put forth. Lincoln's successor, the next president, Johnson, was not as people-friendly as the president should be. His plan was very similar to Lincoln's, with a few harsher exceptions. Johnson gave pardons to those taking the oath, but he would not give pardon to high Confederate officials and military leaders, especially if they had personal property worth $20,000 or more. States had to completely abolish slavery and had to repeal their secession ordinance before being readmitted. They were able to select their own congressional officials. In addition, Johnson did not enforce equality for African Americans and allowed Southern elite to intimidate and terrorize African Americans. The Radical Republicans, a group of mostly Northern Radical Republicans, did not take too kindly to the South, whom they said had caused the Civil War. Their aim was to punish the Southerners and continue protective tariffs, institute a national banking system, and keep the Republican Party in office. They were instrumental in insisting that Congress push through rules and regulations to help the freedmen and start the civil rights movements of 1866, as well as the eventual impeachment of President Johnson. Think about how these plans were similar and different. How did they aim to preserve the Union afterwards and punish the South? All right, so that's going to be it for today's lesson. We talked about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. We talked about the 3 plans for Reconstruction, and we talked about Lincoln's assassination. So your job for this video assignment is going to be to click on the link in the video's description, and it's going to take you to a paragraph. It's a fill in the blank where you're going to have words up in the word bank, and you're going to have to put them correctly inside the paragraph. So if you listened to this lecture, you should be able to do this fairly easily. Remember, this is your first assignment. If you do both video assignments this week, you're going to be entered to win a $25 gift card. So make sure you guys do both assignments, okay? All right, we will see you guys Wednesday at 9:30, where you can show your answers to me over Zoom, or you can email me your answers. See you guys.